Chapter 2. Late to the party. How much longer? I've never known a scythe to be so impatient. Then you do not know many scythes. We are an impatient and irascible lot. Honorable Scythe Sidney Posuelo of Amazonia was already present when Captain Jericho Subernanes arrived on the bridge, just after dawn. Jericho wondered if the man ever slept. Maybe scythes hired people to sleep for them. "Half a day at full speed," Jericho answered. "We'll be there by 1800, just as I said yesterday, Your Honor." Posuelo sighed. "Your ship is too slow." Jericho grinned. "All this time, and now you're in a hurry?" "Time is never of the essence until someone decides that it is." Jericho couldn't argue the logic. "In the best of worlds, this operation would have happened a long time ago." To which Posuelo responded, "In case you haven't noticed, this is no longer the best of worlds." There was truth in that, at the very least. It was not the world that Jericho had grown up in. In that world, the Thunderhead was part of most everyone's life. It could be asked anything. It always answered, and its answers were precise, informative, and just as wise as they needed to be. But that world was gone. The Thunderhead's voice had gone silent now that human beings were all unsavory. Jericho had been marked unsavory once before, as a teenager. It wasn't hard to accomplish. Just 3 instances of shoplifting from a local grocery. Jericho was smug about it for less than a day. Then the consequences began to set in. Being denied communication with the Thunderhead wasn't a big deal for Jericho. But there were other things about the experience that were irksome. Unsavories were last in line for food in the school cafeteria and were always left with the dishes no one else wanted. Unsavories were moved to the front of the classroom where the teachers could keep a watchful eye on them. And while Jericho wasn't cut from the soccer team, probationary meetings were always scheduled in direct conflict with games. It was clearly intentional. Jericho used to think the Thunderhead was being spitefully passive-aggressive, but in time Jericho came to realize that the Thunderhead was merely making a point. Unsavoryism was a choice, and one must decide if the things lost were worth the things gained. Lesson learned. A taste of being unsavory was enough. It took 3 months of towing the line for the big red U to be removed from Jericho's ID. And once it was gone, there was no desire to repeat the experience. "I'm pleased your status has been lifted," the Thunderhead had said, once it was free to speak again. In response, Jericho had told the Thunderhead to turn on the bedroom lights, because giving it an order put the Thunderhead back in its place. It was a servant. It was everyone's servant. It had to do as Jericho commanded. There was comfort in that. And then came the schism between humanity and its greatest creation. Endura sank into the sea, and the Thunderhead declared the entirety of humankind unsavory, all in the same moment. At the time, no one exactly knew what the loss of the World Scythe Council would mean for people. But the Thunderhead's silence hurled the world into a collective panic. Unsavoryism was no longer a choice. It was now a judgment. And silence was all it took to turn servitude into superiority. The servant became the master, and the world became all about pleasing the Thunderhead. "What can I do to lift this judgment?" people cried. "What can I do so that the Thunderhead finds favor in me once more?" The Thunderhead never asked for adoration, yet people now gave it, creating elaborate hoops to jump through, hoping that the Thunderhead would take notice. Of course, The Thunderhead did hear the cries of humanity. It still saw everything. But now, it kept its opinions to itself. Meanwhile, planes still flew. Ambu-drones were still dispatched for people who were deadish. Food was still grown and distributed. The Thunderhead kept the world functioning in the same fine-tuned precision as before. It did what it saw fit for the human race as a whole. But if you wanted your desk lamp turned on, you had to do it yourself. Scythe Posuelo stayed on the bridge, monitoring their progress for a bit longer. It was smooth sailing, but smooth sailing was a monotonous endeavor, especially to one not accustomed to it. He left to take breakfast in his quarters, his forest green robe billowing behind him as he went down the narrow stairs toward the lower decks. Jericho wondered what sort of things went through a Scythe's mind. Did he worry about tripping over his robe? Did he relive his past gleanings? Or was he merely thinking about what he'd have for breakfast? "He's not a bad sort," said Wharton, the ship's deck watch officer who had been in position much longer than Jericho had been in command of the ship. "I actually like him," said Jericho. "He's a lot more honorable than some of the other honorable Scythes I've come across." "The fact that he chose us for the salvage says a lot." "Yes, I'm just not sure what it says." "I believe it says you chose your career path wisely." That was quite a compliment coming from Wharton, who was not a man given over to flattery. But Jericho couldn't take the full credit for the decision. "I just took the Thunderhead's advice." A few years earlier, when the Thunderhead suggested Jericho might be happy pursuing a life at sea, it had annoyed Jericho to no end, because the Thunderhead was right. It had made a perfect assessment. Jericho had already been thinking along those lines, but to hear the Thunderhead make the suggestion was like a spoiler to the story. Jericho knew there were many seafaring lives to choose from. There were people who traveled the globe in search of the perfect wave to surf. Others spent their time racing sailboats or traversing oceans in tall ships, modeled after vessels from bygone eras. But these were pastimes that served no practical purpose beyond the sheer joy of it. Jericho wanted a pursuit of happiness that was also functional, a career that added something tangible to the world. Marine salvage was the perfect ticket, and not just dredging up things that the Thunderhead intentionally sank to provide work for the salvage industry. That was no better than children digging up plastic dinosaur bones in a sandbox. Jericho wanted to recover things that had truly been lost, and that meant developing a relationship with the Scythems of the world. Because while ships under the Thunderhead's jurisdiction never met with untimely ends, Scythe vessels were prone to mechanical failure and subject to human error. Shortly out of secondary school, Jericho took a position as a junior apprentice with a second-rate salvage team in the western Mediterranean. Then, when Scythe Dali's yacht sank in the shallow waters off the coast of Gibraltar, it gave Jericho an unexpected opportunity for advancement. Using standard diving gear, Jericho was one of the first to the wreck, and while the others were still surveying the scene, Jericho, against captain orders, went inside, found the body of the deadish Scythe in his cabin, and brought him to the surface. Jericho was fired on the spot. No surprise. After all, it was mutinous to disobey a direct order. But it was part of a calculated move. Because when Scythe Dali and his entourage were revived, the first thing the man wanted to know was who had pulled him from the sea. In the end, the Scythe was not only grateful, but exceptionally generous. He granted the entire salvage team a year of immunity from gleaning, but wanted to bestow something special on the one who had sacrificed everything to retrieve the body of the deadest Scythe. For, clearly, that individual had the priorities in order. Scythe Dolly asked what Jericho had hoped to achieve in life. "I'd like to run my own salvage operation someday," Jericho told the Scythe, thinking Dolly might put in a good word. Instead, the Scythe brought Jericho to the E.L. Spence, a spectacular 100-meter AGOR ship converted for marine salvage. "You shall be this vessel's captain," Dolly proclaimed, and since the Spence already had a captain, the Scythe gleaned him on the spot, then instructed the crew to be obedient to their new captain or be gleaned themselves. It was, to say the least, very surreal. It was not the way Jericho had wanted to achieve command, but had no more choice in the matter than the gleaned captain. Realizing that a crew would not easily take orders from a 20-year-old, Jericho lied, professing to be 40-something, but having recently turned the corner, setting back to a more youthful self. Whether or not they believed it was their business. It took a long time for the crew to warm up to their new captain. Some acted out in secret ways. The bout of food poisoning that first week, for instance, could likely be traced back to the cook. And although genetic testing would have determined precisely whose feces had been found its way into Jericho's shoes, pursuing it wasn't worth the trouble. The Spence and its crew traveled the world. Even before Jericho's command, the salvage team had made a name for itself. But their new captain had the sense to hire a team of Tasmanian divers with gill-form breathers. Having a dive team that could breathe underwater, combined with a first-rate retrieval crew, made them sought after by Scythes around the world. And the fact that Jericho made retrieval of the deadish first priority over salvage of lost property gained them even greater respect. Jericho had raised Scythe Akhenaten's barge from the bottom of the Nile, retrieved Scythe Earhart's deadish body from an ill-fated flight, and when Grand Slider Amundsen's pleasure sub sank into icy waters off the Rose Shelf region of Antarctica, the Spence was summoned to retrieve him. And then, toward the end of Jericho's first year of command, Endura sank in the middle of the Atlantic, setting the stage for the greatest salvage operation in history. Yet the curtains of that stage remained resolutely closed. Without the Grand Slayers of the World Scythe Council, there was no one in the world who could authorize a salvage. And with Goddard raving in North America that the perimeter of reverence not be breached, Endura's ruins remained in limbo. Meanwhile, various regional Scythedoms that had aligned with Goddard patrolled the perimeter, gleaning anyone caught there. Endura sank in water 2 miles deep, but it might as well have been lost in the space between stars. With all that intrigue, it had taken quite a while for any regional Scythedom to dredge up the nerve to attempt to salvage. And as soon as Amazonia declared its intention, others joined in. But since Amazonia was the first to stick its neck out, it insisted on being in charge. Other Scythedoms squawked, but no one denied Amazonia, mainly because it meant the region would bear the brunt of Goddard's anger. "You do realize that our current heading is a more than a few degrees of course," Chief Wharton pointed out to the captain, now that Posuelo was no longer on the bridge. "We'll correct the course at noon," Jericho told him. "It will delay our arrival by a few hours. Nothing more awkward than arriving too late in the day to begin the operations, but too early to call it a night." "Good thinking, sir," Wharton said, then took a quick glance outside and corrected himself, a bit abashedly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. My mistake. It was cloudy just a moment ago." "No need to apologize, Wharton," Jericho said. "I don't care either way, especially on a day when there's as much sunshine as cloud cover." Yes, Captain, Wharton said. No disrespect intended. Jericho would have smiled, but that would have been disrespectful to Wharton's, whose apology, although unnecessary, was genuine. While it was a mariner's job to mark the position of the sun and stars, they were simply not accustomed to meteorologically fluidity. Jericho was from Madagascar, one of the world's 7 charter regions, where the Thunderhead employed different social structures to better the human experience. And people flocked to Madagascar because of popular uniqueness of its mandate. All children in Madagascar were raised genderless and forbidden to choose a gender until reaching adulthood. Even then, many didn't choose a single state of being. Some, like Jericho, found fluidity to be their nature. I feel like a woman beneath the sun and the stars. I feel like a man under the cover of clouds. Jericho had explained to the crew when assuming command. A simple glance at the skies will let you know how to address me at any given time. It wasn't the fluidity that stymied the crew. That was common enough. But they had trouble getting used to the meteorological aspect of Jericho's personal system. Having been raised in a place where such things were the norm rather than the exception, it never even occurred to Jericho that it could be an issue, until leaving home. Some things simply made a person feel feminine. Other things made a person feel masculine. Wasn't that true of everyone, regardless of gender? Or did binaries deny themselves the things that they didn't fit in the mold? Well, regardless, Jericho found the faux pas and overcompensations more humorous than anything else. How many other salvage teams do you think will be there? Jericho asked Wharton. Dozens, said Wharton, and more on the way. We're already late to the party. Jericho dismissed the notion. Not at all. We're carrying the Scythe in charge, which means we're the flagship of the operation. The party can't start until we get there, and I intend to make a grand entrance. I have no doubt of that, sir, said Wharton, because the sun had slipped behind a cloud. At sunset, the Spence neared the spot where the island of the Enduring Heart had sunk. There are 73 ships of various classes waiting just outside the perimeter of reverence, Chief Wharton informed Captain Sobranis. Scythe Posuelo couldn't hide his distaste. They're no better than the sharks that devoured the Grand Slayers. As they began to pass the outermost vessels, Jericho noted a ship much larger than the Spence directly in their path. We'll plot a course around her, said Wharton. No, said Jericho. Maintain our current heading. Wharton looked worried. We'll ram her. Jericho gave him a wicked grin. Then she'll have to move. Posuelo smiled. And this will make it clear from the beginning who is in charge of this operation, he said. I like your instincts, Jerry. Wharton darted a glance at Jericho. Out of respect, no one on the crew called their captain Jerry. That was reserved for friends and family. But Jericho allowed it. The Spence surged forward at full speed, and the other ship did move, but only when it became clear that the Spence would truly ram her if it didn't. It was a game of chicken, handily won. Position us dead center, Jericho instructed as they crossed into the perimeter of reverence. Then notify the other ships that they can join us. At 6 a.m. tomorrow. Salvage crews can begin sending drones down to survey the wreckage. Tell them that all information is to be shared, and anyone caught withholding information is subject to gleaning. Posuelo raised an eyebrow. Are you speaking for the Scythedom now, Captain? Just trying to ensure compliance, Jericho said. After all, everyone's subject to gleaning, so I'm not telling them something they don't already know. I'm just putting it into a new perspective. Posuelo laughed out loud. Your audacity reminds me of a junior Scythe I used to know. Used to? Posuelo sighed. Scythe Anastasia. She perished along with her mentor, Scythe Curie, when Endora sank. You knew Scythe Anastasia? Asked Jericho, duly impressed. Yes, said Posuelo, but all too briefly. Well, said Jericho, perhaps whatever we raise from the depths can bring her some peace. We have wished Scythe Anastasia and Curie luck on their trip to Endora and the inquest against Goddard. I can only hope that the Grandslayers, in their wisdom, will disqualify him, thereby ending his bid for High Blade. As for Munera and me, we must travel halfway around the world to find the answers we seek. My faith in this perfect world now hangs by the final thread of a fraying tether. That which was perfect will not remain so for long. Not while our own flaws fill the cracks and crevices, eroding all that we have labored to create. Only the Thunderhead is beyond reproach, but I do not know its mind. I share none of its thoughts, for I am a Scythe. And the Thunderhead's realm is beyond my reach, just as my solemn work is outside of its global jurisdiction. The founding Scythes feared our own hubris, feared that we couldn't maintain the virtue, selflessness, and honor that our job as Scythes requires. They worried that we might grow so full of ourselves, so bloated by our own enlightenment, that we would, like Icarus, fly too close to the sun. For more than 200 years, we have proved ourselves worthy. We have lived up to their grand expectations. But things have changed in the blink of an eye. There is, I know, a failsafe left by the founding Scythes, a contingency should the Scythedom fail. But if I find it, will I have the courage to take action? From the Post-Mortem Journal of Scythe Michael Faraday, March 31st, Year of the Raptor.